Hello back, everybody. I'm going to, can everybody hear me, by the way? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the next hour, we're going to have 3 presentations. It's going to be a whiz through a lot of interesting and thought-provoking ideas, opportunity for you all to participate and ask questions. The first speaker today is Dr. Elizabeth Nicholl, who is an existential-analytic psychotherapist who's going in private practice, who's going to speak to us all the way from Dorset, Wiltshire, beautiful part of the country, about her journey of finding her voice. So it's a paper called Finding My Voice, Telling Stories with Heuristic Self-Search Inquiry. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Diana. So this talk is in part a reflection on the methodological issues I faced when conducting my PhD research. So I will give you an overview of the research methods I used, but I would like you to listen with the question in mind as to whether what they produce is useful, and if so, is it useful in unexpected ways, if at all? So I've based the talk on the article that was published in the European Journal for Psychotherapy and Counselling earlier this year. It was called Finding My Voice, but I'm not going to go into detail about my own story today. What I'm going to think about is what my overriding concern has been, which is always very much about how I can hear the other in both research and as a psychotherapist. So my research was focused upon how people diagnosed with schizophrenia experienced their personal therapy. And it was rooted in my personal experience that I explored in depth in the article. So in summary, after having been diagnosed with schizophrenia in my late teens, I recovered after some years and then spent many years hiding it. I then only revealed it without significant repercussions to those who needed to know. So the NHS trust I worked for at one point and my first therapist. And so when I had to find a new therapist and have an assessment with her, I hadn't anticipated a wholly negative response when disclosing this to her. Having felt judged and unheard by her, it resulted in me feeling the shame of madness crashing back onto me. So that's the incident that's at the heart of my research. And I think it's important to say this is where my research has come from, but we'll see where it led me. So what was also present throughout the research process was a comment made after I presented at a conference just as I was commencing my PhD. And that was that my story shouldn't be submitted to the research process, as this would deaden it. My story was more akin to literature and maybe better told in a literary way. So this then raised the question for me as to whether it's desirable to take a systematic approach to personal experience when conducting psychotherapeutic research. And I'd also like to extend this to what we do in our psychotherapeutic practice. So to just give some brief consideration to qualitative research, it's been claimed that it is particularly valuable in providing a forum for the voices of those who may usually be excluded from academic discourse, and that it's therefore most suited to exploring individuals' experiences of illness. So where individuals with mental illnesses are commonly viewed as different, this difference potentially exacerbates feelings of fear and stigma, and so it's argued that qualitative research can offer them the opportunity to relate their stories of marginalisation. So my aim from the outset was to try and hear the other and to translate my participants' words in a way that might diminish the repression that can occur when retelling another's story. For that reason, I felt that Bruner's narrative analysis offered me the opportunity to acknowledge the socio-cultural and historical contexts of the participants, including the influence of the institution and the dominant medical model paradigm upon their personal agency. That was my desire. I think, you know, there are some assumptions underpinning narrative research that both participant and researcher have personal agency in constructing a story for themselves, and that as humans we desire meaning, and so telling stories about our experiences are a way of creating meaning, and that narrative research is a co-constructed dialogue between the storyteller and the listener. So, as Lyotard stated, the speech acts relevant to this form of knowledge are performed not only by the speaker but also by the listener. And so, you know, this was something that spoke very much to me because of my concern about hearing the other and how to translate their words. So it was only towards the end of the research process, while I was writing up the discussion chapter, that it became more apparent to me that I actually had a pressing need to tell my own story. And this was kind of felt in my body. I was almost resisting writing up the discussion chapter. I tried so hard to hear what other people were saying and to present their words in my findings chapter, that when I started writing it up, it just felt as though something was missing. The process of research really is a personal one and can often be more about the researcher needing to work through their own issues. But how was I to acknowledge this? And so it became evident that maybe heuristic research is one means where I could incorporate my personal experiences into the research process. So, you know, Mistaka's heuristic inquiry is a phenomenological research method that focuses on investigating human experience, and that throughout the research process, which is an autobiographic process, the researcher is very present, is central to the process. Now, I chose to employ Selah Smith's adaptation of Mistaka's heuristic method, which she saw as offering the possibility of opening a radical shift from the medical model and allowing a view of a person who can engage himself or herself in life and make choices even in the presence of severe personal problems or diagnosis. So what Selah Smith formulated was heuristic self-search inquiry. And she argued that the final frontier of human knowledge is the internal world, or interiority, claiming that it's an area that's been resisted as a legitimate source of scientific knowledge. She also argues that there is the danger in much heuristic research that the findings will be derived from the participants rather than from within the researcher, and that there's been a move to an observation of experience rather than being immersed in a self-search. So this is what I did. I used this as a means of exploring my own pain, I suppose spending some time in indwelling, looking at maybe what my blind spots were. And my hope was that this self-search inquiry would allow me to speak of the difficulty of having been given a diagnosis, of having hidden it and passed for what might be perceived as normal for over 20 years, as well as to illuminate any blind spots in order to hear my participants' stories more clearly, to in effect bracket my stuff. Now, I did find it a useful exercise, but also a rather solipsistic one, and I question whether it was really useful beyond what I discovered about myself. Did it really help me to hear the other? Did it really help me clear something in order to be able to present what my participants had said? In addition, where I wanted to tell my own story...
5 minutes.
Oh, what, 5 minutes to speak? Yes, thank you. Where I wanted to tell my own story, this was still being done systematically through the lens of another research method, rather than as a piece of literature. And I think there is this sense that using a research method to tell something about, to say something about personal experience, in this case was really just a means of legitimizing it as a piece of doctoral research. And as one respondent has pointed out, one way out of the inevitable and sterile opposition between science and heuristic experience is in combining first-person report with third-person description, and it offers a way out of a defensive subjectivist position. So although heuristic self-search inquiry could be a useful method in its own right, in combining it with narrative analysis, I hoped to be able to hold that tension between being prompted to examine my own story as a result of hearing those of others, and of being able to give a voice to my co-participants. So to return to my concern regarding trying to hear the other and to translate their words, might not method and theory get in the way of hearing the other? How do we translate what we hear and what is done to the other in the process? So to bring this talk to a conclusion, I'd like to reflect on what Donna Orange has written about clinical hospitality, because it seems to have particular relevance here. Orange argues that there are specific ethical challenges in psychotherapeutic work, and that Emmanuel Levinas, Jacques Derrida, and Paul Ricoeur's writings on hospitality can help us restore dignity to our clients. These three philosophers can act as reminders of the vocational aspects of a profession, often mired in the pressures to diagnose and prescribe, to evade and murder, to totalize and finalize. This is not only relevant for psychotherapeutic work, but also for the researcher when considering how to do justice to their participants' stories. In offering hospitality to the other, it is possible that we might restore their and our own humanity. What is of particular significance in my research was the challenge of Ricoeur's ethics of hospitable translation. Both as practitioners and researchers, we have an ethical responsibility to our clients and to our participants. And I believed it to be extremely important to present my participants' words as clearly as possible, although I understood that in narrating the story that was told by my participants, that I was already placing my own construction on it. As Orange puts it, when I translate your words into my own meaning, I have already betrayed you. We're both devastated strangers walking uninvited into each other's house, disrupting each other's sense of being at home. Ricoeur offers us the possibility through linguistic hospitality of a meeting with and acceptance of the genuine otherness of the other. What is required of the translator, the practitioner, the researcher, is that they abandon their search for the perfect translation and mind their own resources in order to offer care. And
1 minute.
Thank you. I do have a timer. And this is what I was attempting to explore in my own pain. We're limited by our incapacity to understand the other and therefore need to accept our not knowing and to be sure in ourselves that this is good enough. As Ricoeur writes, the dream of the perfect translation amounts to the wish that translation would gain without losing. It is this very same gain without loss that we must mourn until we reach an acceptance of the impassable difference of the peculiar and the foreign. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nichols. Would anybody like to ask any questions? I must say but it was a very rich information packed in a very short time. So I suppose that as a lot of people have a lot of thoughts they might not be able to focus specifically on, but as a general kind of conversation, would you like to ask any particular questions, Dr. Nichols, about how she found her voice, but maybe?
I'd like to ask something, actually, something that's just occurred to me, Liz, if I could.
Yeah.
And just something that's beginning to kind of formulate for me in what I'm hearing and with my own talk. And that is that that when we engage with others, you know, in research interviews, for example, as well as practice, and when we write up our research, it's so easy to think we're representing something, that we're representing something that exists.
Yeah.
And more, I'm kind of understanding that perhaps it's not a representational thing we're doing, it's a creative thing. We're creating meaning. And it seems to me that when we don't recognise that, and we don't celebrate it, and we don't draw on it and use that as our evidence, that's a kind of evidence.
Yes.
But it's a very personal and individual one. That by not doing that, we're kind of undermining ourselves and our practice. And so this whole notion of evidence-based, to me, seems to undermine what we're doing as practitioners, how we are undermines us as people. I think it destabilises us. Sorry, I'm going on because I'm forming. This is just coming to me. This idea.
Yes, and I think when you were saying that, what came to me is maybe that's one of the reasons I found it so difficult to move from presenting my findings to writing my discussion chapter, because it felt like it was all being closed down again. And you know, what came from that, the need to tell my story, was possibly an attempt at extending that creativity, that creative process.
I'm interested in whether Selah Smith was helpful for you in opening things up, or whether it was sort of even worse. You know, it was more self-centeredness. At least Moustakis does allow other people in, whereas Selah's just sort of just nothing but self-centered, and other people have just got walk-on parts in your story, if they're lucky. Was it nevertheless helpful or not?
Do you know, I think it was helpful for me. I think this is a very complex thing here. I can't dismiss it entirely. I find that focus on the self very uncomfortable, which is why I resisted heuristics in the first place. But maybe it was something I had to do. In terms of my own personal development, my healing, because I think it kind of finished off the therapeutic work. Well, I don't think it's ever finished, but it extended the therapeutic work that I'd been doing for years in therapy. In terms of whether it did what I said it was doing, clearing my blind spots to hear others, I'm not really sure. I don't know if it helped me bracket in that way. But as a personal thing, it was uncomfortable, but I think ultimately quite important.
Thank you. I saw some hands. I'm not sure if it's somebody. Tony wanted to ask something, or maybe a couple more people. We've got probably one more question. Time for one more question.
It isn't a question. It's just a feedback. The sentence, the shame of madness. The shame of madness. I'd never thought of it that way. It's quite a powerful phrase, I think.
Yes. Yeah, because I'd carried that shame with me for 20 odd years.
Yeah.
Until I started, actually, funnily enough, it was when I was working in a psychiatric hospital, and things started shifting for me. Yeah. And then going into therapy with a therapist that actually just accepted me for who I was, started the whole process of healing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'd never thought of madness as shaming. I just thought of it as part of life, like, you know. But
yeah,
we have to stop. Thank you very much for the interesting talk and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.